Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. In Somerset, local government looks pretty small. In the 600 or so square miles of my constituency, there are 6, gusting 7 bus routes. One of them is under threat at the moment. There's 1 train station, there are reduced library opening hours, reduced bin collections, limited amounts of small road improvement schemes, absolutely no major road improvement schemes. There's been cuts to drug advisory service, cuts to youth clubs. There's less funding to support the elderly in their own homes and in their own communities. And in return, what they've got is a higher precept for flood protection, they've got a higher precept for adult social care, and they've got higher council taxes. Now that's no criticism of Somerset County Council, Mr. Deputy Speaker. They froze council tax for 6 years when household incomes were tightest, helping families across the county. And they were saddled with the reckless debts of the Lib Dem administration, none of whom can be bothered to turn up for a debate today on local government finance, presumably because they are too busy in the other place turning their back on democracy instead of being here standing up for the communities they pretend to still represent. Those debts, Mr. Deputy Speaker, were £350 million that they racked up when they were running Somerset County Council, and that means that millions of pounds every year from Somerset County Council's budget is being spent on paying the interest on those Lib Dem debts. And all of that is happening whilst in rural areas petrol prices are rising, as they are everywhere, but in rural areas that has an impact on cost of living more quickly. For the many of my constituents who live off the gas grid, heating oil prices have gone up, which has increased their cost of living too. They pay the same for their mobile phone contracts as those who live in cities, and yet they get a fraction of the functionality. Yes. They pay the same for their broadband contracts as those who live in cities, and yet they get a fraction of the connectivity. Their house prices and rents are well above the national average, and yet their wages are well below the national average. It seems so unfair that the solution that the government have come up with to reducing local government funding and widening the gap between urban and rural is to increase the council tax burden on those who live in rural areas, when already in so many areas their cost of living is so much higher than elsewhere. Now, last year, the already unfair gap in funding between urban and rural areas were to widen if it was not for the last-minute intervention of the then Secretary of State, who put in place an interim grant so that rural and urban funding, whilst being cut, would be cut by the same across the board. But that interim grant did nothing to correct the trajectories of those cuts, so that this year the gap between urban and rural widens by just as much as it was always intended to do. That brings with it no reflection of the cost of rurality, it brings with it no reflection of the cost of an ageing demographic, and it brings with it no reflection of our limited ability to grow our economy, given the lack of connectivity or the size of the working age population as a proportion of the population as a whole. This year, Somerset County Council and the district councils in our area have now set their budgets, and those painful decisions have been taken. So for this year, really, it is all too late. But, to quote my honourable friend for North Dorset, who is no longer in his place, we have to be aware, as he said in this debate this time last year, we have to now accept that in rural areas public services have not just been cut to the bone, they've had all of the marrow sucked out too. The disadvantage for rural areas cannot continue, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and so I warmly welcome the announcement that the Secretary of State has made at the dispatch box today, in that the review that he has committed to is ambitious both in scale and scope. Yeah. This is not about claiming that rural areas should be at an advantage over rural. It is simply about making things fair. And that requires a full understanding of the needs of the cost of delivering public services in rural areas, and a formula that allocates funds accordingly. But that review is urgent. I note that the Secretary of State has said that the review will be completed ahead of the introduction of the full retention of business rates for 2019-20. But we cannot leave it until this debate in 2 years' time to be clear on the result of that review. Councils need to know by this debate next year, in January 2018, what the outcome of the review is, so that they can know that the jam tomorrow that we have been promising throughout these very difficult 4 years means that their retention of business rates will be baselined at X and they can start to plan accordingly. Certainty, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think is all that they have left to ask for, now that it is clear that there ain't going to be any more money in the near future either. But so too must the government also set a mechanism for the ongoing review of that baselining of business rates once the business rate retention has been introduced. For I'm sure the Secretary of State and his team will agree that the potential for economic development will vary from region to region, area to area. And when you consider that in many of the smaller and more hard-pressed county councils, the economic development team, if indeed there is one left, is one person, then the opportunities to grow the economy are somewhat more limited, and we must just have an eye to the idea that once we have baselined in 2019-20, there may be some areas who, through their entrepreneurial guile, are able to grow their economies more quickly and their rate spaces more quickly than others, and therefore there will be a requirement to reset from time to time so that the deal remains equitable. Or, and I am equally happy with either solution, the Secretary of State could direct that the growth deals that are allocated better reflect the areas where skills, connectivity or workforce availability are most difficult. But in the South West, we lag behind the rest of the country on infrastructure spending, we are well behind on connectivity, and we are well behind on our skills base too. And yet, when the growth deals were announced recently, the deal for the Devon, Cornwall, the Somerset and Devon LEP even, was particularly poor. It would be great to see the growth deals reflecting the areas where the economic development challenge is greatest, so that this entrepreneurial idea, which I wholly support in the full retention of business rates, we start with equality of opportunity, because we've got that connectivity, we've got the skills, and we've got the infrastructure in place. Of course.
I'm very grateful to him giving way. I'm sure he's aware in the industrial strategy white paper, it does refer to this point and about taking in future having regard to per capita spending throughout the country, rather than this spending being concentrated in London and other regions which are getting the lion's share at the moment.
I absolutely agree. I mean, there is something very empowering, very conservative about giving councils the opportunity to be masters of their own financial destiny, in order to give them the means and say, look, if you go out and you attract business into your area, the rewards for that are yours to keep and yours to spend on improved public services for your communities. But we have to just be aware that when we get that going, we need to have stacked the growth deals in favour of those areas where that challenge is greatest, so that they really can take things into their own hand and grow their economies as keenly as the areas that already benefit from better connectivity, better infrastructure and better skills. Now, it is sad, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that the Chief Secretary and the Chancellor have already left their seats, because there was one other plea that I was going to make in order to alleviate Somerset's problems in the short term. The government has encouraged local authorities to do as they wish by mechanisms such as the New Homes Bonus or the Community Infrastructure Levy. However, not too long ago, there was an aggregates levy which was designed so that the minerals and aggregates that were extracted in certain areas would be taxed, and 10% of that was supposed to stay locally in order to fund local betterment and mitigation. That has drifted off into the centre and is no longer benefiting the communities that suffer from hosting those industries. Now, why does that matter to us in Somerset? Well, in Somerset, the Chancellor raises £24.7 million a year from the aggregates levy, and the 10% that we have lost is worth £2.47 million. That's an awful lot of bus routes, an awful lot of youth centres, an awful lot of community support for the elderly. It's an awful lot of library hours, recycling centres, bin collections and everything else. And so my ask to the Chancellor is, as they put that in place and they offer the community infrastructure levy to communities who might find fracking appealing, and as they offer the New Homes Bonus as an incentive for communities who might want to host more housing, can we have back the 10% of the aggregates levy that was supposed to have been the incentive for hosting quarrying. Because in my constituency, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we are doing an awful lot to facilitate national infrastructure projects. In the Cheddar Valley, the lorries going towards Hinckley now number more than 300 a day, as Hinckley has gone to 24-hour-a-day building. The pylons that National Grid will need to build soon to connect Hinckley into the national grid will roll through my constituency very shortly indeed. All of that building work, all of those quarry lorries are having an impact on our roads, they are causing potholes, they are causing congestion, and we are getting zero in mitigation, whilst also getting a very poor deal on local government finance too. Public services in Somerset, Mr. Speaker, have been squeezed right down, but the adult social care requirements will continue to grow and grow and grow. And we shouldn't see libraries, bus services, support groups, day centres as being something that can be cut in order to just divert money across towards adult social care. That is a false economy. It is those bus routes, it is those day centres, it is those community support groups, it is those libraries that actually allow people to lead independent lives, keeping in their own homes independent of the adult social care system. And it is only when we make them so isolated and so lonely that we end up with needing to pay more and more and more on adult social care. So let's move as quickly as we can to get the review that the Secretary of State has promised today done. It is a very, very welcome announcement for which I, and I'm sure many colleagues, are very grateful indeed. I have every confidence that that review will make a huge difference to rural areas, perhaps in terms of the money that we get, but much, much more importantly, in terms of the perception of our constituents that the system is not stacked against them, that they get a fair cut of the government's cash. I urge the Secretary of State, and I know he wants to be bold in the scope and scale of the review that he embarks on, but I also urge him to do it urgently and to get it done this year, so that next year, when we have this debate, we can offer our councils much, much more certainty for what full business rate retention looks like and what the advantage of that to them will be.